Greetings. Welcome to ITR Live. I'm your host, Chris Hagenow. We are back here in Studio 130 and some other remote location to be announced later with John Hendrickson. And we are ready to thrill and excite you on another fun-filled, action-packed episode of the gold standard in Iowa conservative entertainment. John, welcome.
Thank you.
Good. So you are back in the remote studio. Have you named the studio there, or is it just generic place?
It's just a generic place.
That's unfortunate. I expect more creativity out of you, but anyway, what?
I wish I was back in Studio 130 with you.
Well, and that's, I wish you were too, but one of the things we teased out that we have some exciting announcements coming up, and Studio 130 has a lot to do with that. So anyway, with that having been said, in our last episode, John, we had a lot to say about Governor Tim Walz, and I guess it inspired you. You retreated back to your native homeland for some of his leadership, and so we've got a lot to talk about on this. I want to continue a little bit of the national theme today. We've been talking a lot, but here we are in the thick of campaign season, and a lot of what's going on is at the presidential level. So, where do you think we're at with this presidential race? I mean, I think a month, 6 weeks ago, we were all feeling very optimistic about this. Trump campaign talking about winning Minnesota, for example, but I don't think that's where we're at these days. What are you thinking?
No, I'm actually a little more pessimistic, and I don't know whether to go by the polls, because I've seen polls in favor of Trump, but more polls that are in favor of Harris. But what concerns me is the Harris has had a momentum going now for a couple of weeks, and that's going to keep going at least through next week because that's their convention. And one thing is that she has not really taken a position on any issues, and the media has been really complicit in kind of whitewashing her record and helping to sell her as a moderate, and also Tim Walz as a moderate. And the other thing is that I think the Trump campaign is starting to lose focus a little bit. I'm a little concerned with that they're focusing a little bit too much on maybe the controversy over whether Walz embellished his rank, and Harris's identity, and who has a bigger crowd at their rallies. And the focus needs to be on some of the key issues, inflation and immigration, certainly some of the major foreign policy issues that people are concerned about, and really they really need to expose how left-wing both Harris and Walz are, and really show the American people that these are not moderate people. I mean, Harris is running ads now basically saying that she is tough on the border. In fact, I was just watching an interview just before you and I connected. They're interviewing a sheriff out in California who was very upset because he's featured in an immigration ad that Harris is running, and basically, Harris is selling herself as being tough on immigration, and this sheriff is saying, no, that's not the truth. She is an open borders liberal, and same thing with her. The only position she's taken on an issue now is basically copying the no tax on tips.
Yeah.
And you look at her campaign website, there's no position of anything. And so I think what's happening here is we've got to get back on message. Republicans have to get back on message, and we saw a little bit of that with the Trump Elon Musk interview when they were talking a little bit about the economy, and when President Trump was in Montana for his rally, he focused a lot on the economy. But we need to go back and start hammering on these issues, and otherwise, I'm worried right now, and I tend to be a pessimist anyways, though, but maybe it's not as bad as I think it is.
Well, I tend to agree with most of what you said, John. The race has tightened to the point where I feel like today it's a coin flip, maybe even a slight advantage to Harris. Uh, the one thing that I think is very clear, and I'm not getting into crowd sizes, but there is new enthusiasm on the Democrat side of the ticket. They were demoralized. They weren't excited about Biden, and that was maybe his age, maybe it was some of the problems they have internally with some of the liberal base, specifically on Israel policy. But they've turned that around, and so now we've probably got a base election. What's going to happen? Who can turn out their people? But at some point, the American people, I think, are owed some level of substance from the Harris campaign about what they want to do. What is their vision for America? They don't want to run on the record of what's been done over the last 4 years. They want to try and present Kamala Harris as somehow new when she's actually been in office. And I know she's only the vice president, but you have to own that. Mm-hmm. And similarly, running on what President Trump did and what his record is, because it ought to be about two competing visions for America, and a lot of it is just noise apart from that. And I'm confident that if it's about different visions for America, then I think the conservative direction wins. I still believe that this is a right of center country that wants right of center solutions going forward. So let's present those. I think there's also some real movement among younger people, and that's borne out in some of these polls as well. But again, historically, those folks aren't always reliable in how they vote. They turned out in mass for Barack Obama, and they turned out in fairly decent numbers for Joe Biden. Will they turn out for Kamala Harris? I don't know the answer to that. But so you teased this out just a minute ago, John. One of these things that's finally starting to come out, at least some amount of substance, is this idea of the taxing tips as wages, specifically in the service industry. So think about, you go to a restaurant, you tip your however much, and is that tip subject to taxation? And right now it's not. No, right now it is.
Yes.
And so take it away from there. Donald Trump originally proposed no taxing on that. And now that's a novel new idea from the Harris campaign. Do I have that right?
Yeah. About 2 months ago, I believe, former President Trump unveiled this idea in Las Vegas, in Nevada, not taxing tips. And then all of a sudden, was it this week or last week, late last week, also in Nevada, Vice President Harris now says the same thing. And of course, claims it's a new idea and basically is taking credit for it. What was interesting is watching the media response to it as well. When President Trump unveiled no new tax on tips, the media went ballistic and said, "Oh, you can't do that. It's it's going to deprive revenue from the government, and it's going to create problems." And the media had a different reaction from when Harris did this, which was interesting. I mean, it just shows again the Republicans are fighting a several front war. We're not just battling the Democrats in this campaign, but we're also taking on the traditional media. That's sort of being in a sense a communication arm of the Harris campaign. But as you and I were talking before, this issue is sort of a class warfare issue, and from a policy perspective, I've got some problems with it. I can see why it's popular for some people, and we can get into that, but it may not be the best policy. I mean, I think Senator Cruz has already introduced legislation in terms of repealing tax on tips. But let's not forget, too, that the Biden administration pushed through as part of the, I think, was it either the Inflation Reduction Act or one of the massive bills they pushed through was expanding the IRS, 80,000 agents. And part of that was to crack down on on this problem to make sure that that people were paying.
Did I see that this was estimated to be about $250 million annually, or 200? Is that ring a bell?
Yes, yeah. They're
Okay,
saying, well, yeah, and then roughly over 100 billion in a 10-year period.
yeah,
So
and
of lost.
I guess I'm skeptical of the media and the left's newfound appreciation for the amount of revenue coming in, and like in the past, they just print the money and forget about it.
Yes,
But
yeah,
so do
yeah,
whatever you want. I agree with you. This is politically driven to try and win votes. I'm not crazy about the proposal, other than if it's just tips in the way they're classically thought of, that's one thing. But many folks, that is the lion's share of their income.
mhm,
Especially in for example, the restaurant industry. A server's tips is the majority of what they make, but now they don't pay income tax. Would not pay income tax on that.
yeah,
Whereas other folks would pay income tax. The guy in the back that's scrubbing the dishes is paying income tax on all of his wages.
mhm.
And so it feels like a carve out. And when we start carving things out of the tax code, it makes it unfair for everyone else, right, John? I mean, that's
Yeah.
the way we have typically looked at these things, right?
Yeah. In fact, when you look at, for example, principles of good of sound policy of taxation, one of the top principles is fairness. For a tax code, it should be fair. And so, in other words, the tax code shouldn't be used to put one group of taxpayers against another. You shouldn't have carve outs, and we see this in all kinds of not just income tax, but a big one in property taxes is carving out for seniors, and it's very
Mm-hmm.
popular. Not just here in Iowa, but in other states. Whenever you look at a property tax bill, there's always a carve out for senior citizens, and you see that argument with there is that this group says, well, I shouldn't have to pay this tax, or I should be exempt from it, or and what that does, it just shifts the burden to someone else, and it also makes it more harder and drives up that tax, makes it harder to reform, and so that's one reason why I don't like this idea, because it will one, it makes our system more complex, it makes it less fair, and then also the other thing is that right now it's also taking the conversation away from what's needed is a more a more broader discussion on needed tax reform.
Right.
And so right now we're debating, whether we should be taxing tips. We should actually be having a larger conversation about what should we do with our broken federal tax code, which really needs to
Right.
be reformed. For even we should be having a debate on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, of
Right.
whether or not that should be renewed or not. Harris has opposed that, and right now she's not even taking a position on it. She should have to.
Yeah, absolutely, because that's coming up, because
Yeah,
it expires, and I think that's in the relatively near future, right, John? When is that?
2025.
Yeah,
And so most everyone will see a tax increase,
right,
because those brackets will revert to the pre
right.
levels.
Well,
And
we're
we're
going to
not.
have a lot to say about that as that comes a little closer into view, because obviously it impacts all of us because we're all federal taxpayers, but there are kind of that interplay in what it does at the state level as well. So, and I don't know that, knowing the way Washington, D.C. works, that it would be simply an extension of that. They would probably extend parts of it or go deeper in others and not extend other parts of it. But yeah, there's a major piece of legislation on tax policy that needs to probably come up in the next Congress to deal with this. So the other thing too, and I kind of brushed up on this, John, but you wanted to talk about the deficit, the federal deficit, and
Yeah.
where we are at, and some of the milestones. I don't want to make it sound like a good thing that we are hitting on the federal deficit and ultimately the federal debt and what that means. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, this is it's one of these things that I think we've just become numb to. And so, for example, we just hit another milestone where the national debt has reached the 35 trillion mark. And it's even hard to comprehend what that really means because, just not too long ago, we hit 30, we talked about 34 trillion. Now we're at 35 trillion. The deficit now, just for the first 10 months of our current fiscal year, is roughly, let's see, I have that written down here, almost $2 trillion.
Yeah.
And that's and we're not even end of the fiscal year is coming up in end of September, and so that's going to continue to grow, and those deficits are continuing to project. And the question is why should we care about this? And the reason is that if people want to know why you're paying more for groceries, why are you struggling with cost of living? This is the reason for it, is because of this out of control government spending. And
Well,
it's and I want to say first though that this problem, both parties bear responsibility for this problem. But just from Biden Harris alone, they have increased the debt by almost $7.5 trillion.
yeah.
And what's happened is basically we don't have that money. And so what does the Federal Reserve do? Is they basically just turn on the printing presses. And what does that do? It creates inflation, which it just devalues the dollar, and it creates a situation that we're in now. And it destroys your wages, it destroys your savings. And there's some devastating things, surveys that have come out. For example, CNBC just did a survey. 65% of those they surveyed are basically living paycheck to paycheck. The other thing, another survey I was looking at, is not since the Great Depression we see the highest amount of people that are basically having to return home to live with their parents. Not since the Great Depression. We're seeing massive amounts of people relying on credit cards to meet.
Those numbers continue to reach record highs. The amount of credit card debt in this country.
And this is all alarming, and it's very dangerous. And so this is why this should be a concern. And this is the other frustrating thing. We should be having these conversations on the campaign trail about how are we going to address, our broken budget system, and how are we going to address the national debt, and try to get back to a balanced budget. Chris, you and I talked about in the last episode, basically comparing Iowa and Minnesota. Minnesota is looking at a budget deficit next year. Iowa's looking at projected surpluses. And why is Iowa doing that? Because we have been responsible in our budgeting. Walz just blew close to a $19 billion surplus. Governor Reynolds isn't doing that. And there's no control in Washington whatsoever.
Well, I think this is you spelled it out very well. I think this is one of those times where we talk about tax policy and rates and inflation and almost sometimes feel like I'm back in college sitting through a macroeconomics class, thinking about all the give and take and what happens to these things. But here it's very important for folks to realize where these issues impact them directly. And you talked about that percentage of Americans that are living paycheck to paycheck. But they see their wages aren't going up and the purchasing power of the money they do earn goes down. They're paying more for consumer staple items. They're paying more at the grocery store. They're paying more for whatever item it is. Every American understands that. And these issues that we talk about, John, are central to Americans understanding why they're being pinched and why they are coming up with less and why are they being stretched out. This is the reason why. It is inflation, which is caused by rampant spending. And you're absolutely right. It's not necessarily a Republican or a Democrat thing, although I think it's been at a scale never before seen here with the current administration. But this is why a national conversation about inflation, about the economy, about tax rates, why all of this matters. And it should be top of mind. And I think it is. I think if you quiz voters, they certainly did in the ITR Foundation survey. Inflation in the economy is the top issue, but we're not talking about it right now. It goes back to what we talked about at the outset, John, is that's not what these campaigns are spending time on. And I think is that a lot of Americans are just going to tune it out if they're not speaking to the issues that actually impact their lives. Most people don't care about the size of the rally. Most people don't care about long-standing political feuds. Most people don't care about Kamala Harris's life story or how she got ahead in politics. I kind of do. I kind of think it says a lot about her. But that's not what people are talking about. So let's get on with it.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I mean these are the issues that people care about, and the scary part is how long can we continue to allow the debt to ratchet up before the whole thing collapses, and that's that's a question that's becoming more of a reality every day. I mean, because eventually the ceiling will, the floor will collapse on this because you just cannot continue to spend like this because it's money we don't have. And it's, when we look at through just looking at economic history, countries cannot do this.
Right. Well, I think that's exactly right. And that's the next point I wanted to make, John. These campaigns will be waged on what this means to the individual American. Here's what this, whether it's Harris or Trump and their plan on inflation and who did what and how does that impact your family's bottom line? And that's what the message will be. But let's not forget that we're talking about what could very easily present an existential threat to our nation and our world economy is that this whole house of cards could fall down. And then what does that mean to everyone? Maybe that's the thing that an even bigger chunk of Americans need to be worried about is what happens when we don't get the economy back on track, when we don't get our fiscal house back in order. Very dangerous and very dark times could be lying ahead. And so there's the individual kitchen table answer here, but there's also, we're all in this together at a certain level, and we all need to think about it that way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I think that this has an impact on is this will impact the states. We were talking about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but the states have become so addicted to federal funds, even some of the conservative states, and that's just because the growth of federal government over time. And so the federal government has assumed so much authority over so many different programs, and what happens when the federal government starts to have to start cutting, and that creates some serious problems. Right. And so this is not just something to play games with. The other thing I think we need to be concerned with too, it's another issue that we're not really talking about, although I have to give President Trump credit on, is the other thing that goes along with the deficit is the trade deficit. We've been running massive trade deficits for a long time, and that concerns me as well, because that just shows that we continually be dependent on foreign sources for necessities, including hostile powers. Now, I just was getting over a bad respiratory cold, and I ended up getting put on 3 different antibiotics. And I just happened to look at each of those medications, and what really shocked me was all 3 of those were manufactured in China.
Right. Well, I think we've talked about this on this show. It's been quite some time, John, and maybe we can devote much more time to it in the future. But there's a national security aspect to trade policy that we can debate the merits of open trade, free trade. Is it better for the nation to export certain goods so that we can specialize in other things, that we can make more? We import textiles that are cheaper to have manufactured overseas so that we can make more, computer components or whatever it is we make here, right? Okay, that's usually a purely economic debate, but where I think we are starting to land as a nation is what you said. Should we be able to make core pharmaceuticals? Because if we don't have antibiotics, well, we're in big trouble.
Yeah.
Those are critical to maintaining a certain standard of life in this country. And so we need to work on manufacturing those here. The CHIPS Act, which had a bunch of stuff in it we didn't need, but the idea is that, you saw during COVID and shutdown, like, we need to be able to make certain semiconductors here in this country. We need to ramp up that production here. Basic materials. Can we have a steel industry? What are those basic items that, as a matter of sustaining ourselves, that we need to be able to produce? If it's not being able to get a certain pair of sneakers, okay, we can do without that. I don't tell my sons that, because they like sneakers. But the point being, there are certain things. The key medicines.
Yes, yeah.
They need to be made here, and so we need to focus on that. But the trade deficit, I kind of got far afield on that, but is part of that economic solution that we need to talk about. Okay, John, I'm gonna put you on the spot with something that we didn't talk about, but I kind of came to mind as we were recording here, and I don't want to go into. I guess maybe I'm just teasing this out, and I'm giving you a homework assignment for the next time we convene. In policy circles, there's a lot been made over the tax reform debate that's happening in Nebraska, and I suspect that you've looked at this a little bit. Governor Pillen over there is called a special session, trying to pass a property tax reform bill. I know you've looked at this a little bit. Maybe you're not ready to even talk about it, but I think once that special session is done, and it looks like they got trouble, I'd like to look at what we might be able to take away from that here in Iowa.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any preview thoughts on that conversation.
I think this is very important because as we know, we've been told that at least it's been strongly signaled that coming into the 2025 legislature here in Iowa, it's going to be a property tax year. And I think we can look at what other states have done this year on property taxes and look at some good and bad things, what's going on, and just look at one as how difficult property tax reform is. And we know that here in Iowa, but just looking at what our neighbors in Nebraska are going through, it's a difficult struggle. Yeah. And I think just some quick thoughts on Nebraska is one is there's a lot of, as they say, the devil's in the details. And I think sometimes people get so desperate for property tax reform that they're willing to trade anything to get it. And sometimes it's not. Look. Don't get me wrong. We need property tax reform, but sometimes what they're trying to do is not the best policy, and it could be worse. And so I don't know if what they're trying to do is the best thing, and trying to shifting more to the state, trying to do buy downs and things like that. I'm not I was just having this morning. I was having a conversation with someone about property tax buy downs, and the person I was visiting with was an advocate that thinks that the state should buy down property taxes. Well, my view of that is, okay, that may work, but what happens when you don't put a limit on local government spending? Right. And it just, I don't think it will work. When
local governments in Iowa on average are still growing their spending 6% a year, why would we want to continue to incentivize that by having the state pick up the tab? All we're doing is making it easier for them to continue to spend even more. Yeah. And I think too, so that's one thing. And then on the idea of shifting, just so we're clear, that's not a tax savings. That's just changing the mix.
Yes.
Right. And I think what they're trying to do in Nebraska, at least what they set out to do, was a bunch of base broadening to try and scoot, this through the sales tax, try and collect more dollars and then ship it back out by way of property tax relief. So I think, and even from then, and then I think it devolved from there, because then they didn't have the votes and they kept trying to change the bill, and it just got worse and worse. And now it feels like it's sort of turned into this Frankenstein that's probably going to collapse on its own weight.
Yeah. And I was reading an article, and I don't know if this has been abandoned or not, but I think it was in Governing Magazine about Nebraska, where even the governor was considering even legalizing marijuana as part of it
Yeah.
to try to get revenue from that to lower property taxes. To me, that's not worth it. I mean,
No,
that is a dangerous idea.
no.
Hopefully, that's been abandoned. But the other thing is, I was reading yesterday, Minneapolis, of course, a very socialist area, is wanting to reduce property taxes. You know what they're trying to do? They're looking at a local income tax or a local wealth
Right.
tax in order to offset property taxes, and which is another
Yeah.
terrible idea.
Well, yeah,
But
if you're raising one tax to cut another, you're not cutting taxes. You're just
no,
changing the mix.
yeah,
And that happens all the time in blue and red states.
yeah,
And thankfully, here in Iowa, we have continued to see it clearly that tax cuts, if you want to cut a tax, that means less government spending
yes,
by
yeah,
nature. If you want
yeah,
to continue the same level of spending or continue to grow at the same rate, you're going to have to continue to collect more money from the taxpayer. It's just
yeah,
what tax type you want to grow it in.
that's
And so
right.
I think it's, again, I'd like to come back and really go into depth on this later, John,
Yeah,
once we do a postmortem of what happened in Nebraska
yeah,
and lessons for policymakers in Iowa of the right way to go about, the right way to continue to go about tax reform, specifically property taxes going into next year. But the
yeah,
one thing that I want to make sure is if this fails, it's not because voters don't want property tax relief.
yes,
Yeah, I think perfectly. Voters, whether they're in Minnesota or Nebraska or Iowa, they want changes. They want
yeah.
solutions. And so what do those need to look like?
I will say one thing. I think we should keep an eye on Montana because I think the governor of Montana is moving in the right direction. He has a property task force. I think that is wrapping up or has wrapped up, and basically they have at least some of the things I've seen him say is focusing in the right area and basically saying that the problem with high property taxes in Montana is government spending. And so I was very
Yeah.
encouraged by some of the things coming out of there. And I know in Montana they've had a bill in the legislature to try to limit local government spending, and so it didn't pass, but at least they're moving in the right direction. So that was one positive thing in another state.
Great. All right. Well, let's save all of those thoughts, and we'll come back and go into that in much more detail, both on Nebraska and Montana, and looking ahead towards next year for Iowa. So, all right, John, I'm gonna wrap it up for now, but I appreciate your time. Appreciate you logging in here,
Yeah, I
and go ahead.
just one more thing, and if there's ever time on a future episode, I'd like to talk a little bit about just going back to Governor Walz and just talk a little bit about some of the radicalism of
Hmm.
sort of where that stems from with the Farmer Labor Party and the Nonpartisan League, and I think people might find that interesting.
I know I would, so we will do that. All
Yeah.
right. Well, very
Well,
good. Well, thanks for joining us. Uh, Thanks, listeners. Don't forget to leave us a positive view. Don't forget to review. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And with all of that, we will see you next time on ITR Live.
yeah, it froze a little bit at the end. Yeah, could be mine. Yeah, yeah, yeah.